Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Excited to start our chat today on the Grid Mod Pod. We have Dave. I'm going to let him introduce himself, but we kind of share some common interest, which is, maybe you all probably know, listeners, is everything distribution. Just kidding. But how do we look at the grid? What is the visibility of the grid? And how do we kind of gap where we are currently? How do we bridge that gap that currently exists? So I look forward to having this conversation with Dave of what you have been doing, what you've been up to, and where we can kind of educate our listeners on what's coming next. So with that, I'll throw it over to you and we can get started.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Dr. Cook. I really appreciate it. My name is Dave Herlong. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Ubicquia here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Recently joined the company, actually. Was 30 years at Florida Power & Light here in the southeastern United States, where I spent most of that career in distribution operations and in smart grid. Actually had two parts of my career, started off in technology, actually, and then spent the last 20 plus years really in distribution operations for the most part. Founded our smart grid team. I really found myself to be much of an entrepreneur inside corporate America, really trying to solve some of the hardest energy problems that we had there. And so taking sort of that technology background with a deep operations background from field engineering, construction, control center operations, the whole shoot and match. So fought a lot of hurricanes in my career and was really, toward the end of my career, really helping solve some of the more complex problems. And just like the grid has become digitized dramatically in the last 12 or 15 years. But before that, the grid did not look a lot different than it did, when I was born, frankly, right? And the ability for distribution operations, engineering, reliability folks to really work on not just the safe delivery of energy, the affordability and reliability through data, through the digital revolution that was occurring across the grid, really was a great opportunity there at Florida Power & Light. And here at Ubicquia, we're trying to solve some of those deep problems for the industry as well. So for our customers, for our neighbors, for our community, we can deliver that safe, affordable, reliable promise with resiliency as well.
Right, which I love. And so just like from a perspective, I had an awesome opportunity, well, actually a couple times, to kind of visit multiple distribution system operations centers across the U.S. and seeing really the various maturity curves from those that are crawling to those that are walk run. If anyone wants to read a great document, the DOE put together a 4-volume grid modernization. It really talks through, that maturity scale. And it's something that really ignited my passion to create this platform, to create this opportunity to give those that have done the journey and executed the journey, which is full visibility to the edge, so that we can bring all of, really achieve and succeed on all of the expectations that I think all of our external stakeholders hold of us as operators of the grid, that we have all of this information. And so what I just heard is that, you spent, a large portion of your career building that visibility into the operations of an electric power grid. So that is fascinating, excited, and I can't wait to hear about, kind of your lessons learned and your takeaways. So I guess, we both said it, but, what is the visibility gap? And you kind of shared a little bit in your intro, but break it down. Why is it such a persistent challenge? And why did 15, 20 years ago, most of utilities, were working from a space of paper maps and map boards that were static to where we are now and where a lot of us are on this active journey?
Yeah, the famous map boards, right? Magnets and sticker tape and lots of folks, right? We're using people, we're using our employees, we're using customers as our sensors out in the field. The visibility gap is something that we've coined here and talk about. We really did a lot of great work in the industry over the last 25 years, digitizing and modernizing our power plants, our generation side of the business. And we really brought that down to the transmission and substation. And for the most part, that digital journey has been going on for a long time. And then there was a leap to the smart meter, to the homes, to consumers, to provide the ability to see your bill, to provide energy efficiency options for customers, for billing optimization, that whole piece around the home, right smack in the middle The industry's done a really nice job with some distribution automation, but everything else in the middle, where all of your OpEx, all of your operations and maintenance dollars are spent, most of your customer complaints are spent right in the middle of the grid, from the substation right down to the meter. There's this digital visibility gap. And people like Ubicquia and the team here are really working at shining digital sunshine right in that visibility gap to help improve reliability where most of the outages are. 92% of the outages are right there in this visibility gap. And we have very little ways to directly measure what's going on in that visibility gap. Again, most of the complaints, most of the facility issues, most of the issues, frankly, in tropical storms, ice storms, and hurricanes occur, and the money that's spent to make repairs in that part of the grid are the deepest, are the darkest, where you spend the most time with crews and where your customers get the most frustrated. And so the ability to look into that and leveraging inexpensive and high-powered sensors, the spend level of compute that's getting cheaper and cheaper every day, and great communications along with AI and machine learning to tie all those together to now begin to move from more of an emergency room style reacting to Mother Nature, to weather, to equipment failure, but now becoming more proactive, more predictive. The ability to look into the grid and say, this is what's going to happen over the next week or 2 or 3, and then get your same field engineers, your same crews that are great first responders, great firefighters going into battle in the middle of a storm or the night or a lightning storm, and the ability to do all that predictively, proactively. Imagine a world in which, as the industries we've transformed on this digital journey, we have a customer service journey to go on. Yeah. We're now going to be knocking on doors and telling customers, we're here to fix equipment that's going to fail in the next 7 to 10 days.
So thinking like from the visibility gap, and I just don't think there's an appreciation that really, I worked in the utility industry for 12 years as a consultant. Now, granted, I was mainly focused in the transmission bulk generation space. And when I came into the utility, I really got a full awakening of this other part of the system, which is the distribution system. So when I talk about visibility gap, I think I just wanted to kind of thread that needle a little bit for our listeners. And you said it, we spent a lot of time with automation, controls, intelligence, and data, almost near real time for our generation, which is this massive billion-dollar fleet, trillion-dollar fleet at this point, where it's rotating at 60 hertz and the whole system has to do it together. So and when I say as those that own these assets have a very special need to ensure that everything is operating as the numbers say they are, to simplify. And that boils down to the transmission, because if the transmission suddenly is not available for those electrons to push out on, that generation will not work. So there's like this, very nice integrated tie of the power of bulk generation and transmission. And then once those electrons move down into the distribution world, it wasn't as we were neglecting the distribution systems and we weren't investing, but the need to have that near real-time information after the low side of the transformer inside the substation, you get into your distribution space, just was not there, because the distribution grid in itself and the expectations of the customers knew no different, right? They didn't understand really the phenomena of what it takes from that electron to leave the transmission substation into the distribution down. So I guess I just wanted to tie, what we're talking about is there was sensoring and meters that could relay information, but from the need of your operators and who's going out to put the lines back on after a storm, you could cut the power at the transmission substation distribution level. I'm simplifying, I know, so don't get too offended. And relieve that distribution asset to be de-energized. And then the men can work on it safely, and they can throw up the wires and they can turn the lights back on once all that's done. But as the systems have gotten more complex because of really the mesh networks that we've created over the last 30 years based on new technology such as automatic switching and really evolving this new advanced technology into the distribution. And then also customers, as you said, are becoming more aware that their needs and their awareness is almost real time. So it was like the merging of two phenomena, like the technology is flowing from the ability and capabilities of your bulk generation transmission into the distribution. And then your customers who you're serving are becoming more aware, and it's the lifeline of society. So our expectations of it being present 24/7, 365 is becoming ever more paramount. And so that's the visibility gap, right? Like
Yep.
for 80,
I
90
think that's
years.
a good way to tie it together.
Yeah, you didn't need it, but now, like, it is needed, and there's been an amazing amount of utilities that have bridged that gap, and that's kind of the experience you have, which you're taking into your next spiel. So I guess my next question is, to kind of tee you up and let you explore, is going from this very reactive to proactive management of the grid, and like this digital transformations allowing that to occur. But a lot of fundamentals had to happen before that reality. And so, explore what that would look like for someone who, wants to go from the paper maps and the static boards to this reality that you got to live through.
Well, two reactions to that. One is in the transmission and substation world for years, when we had outages along the network, we had a loss of load. That was what they coined it, right?
Nice.
Well, those are real customers. Those are customers at the end of that line. So bringing that customer-centric focus to the entire system, not just in transmission and substation, but in distribution, like I mentioned before. My second reaction is that this is an incredible industry, the industry that really does reach across company lines and wants to share. And so what you're doing, what AEIC is doing, bringing operational excellence, consistency to the business, lots of sharing across the industry, is really what this industry is made of. And there's not a lot of industries like that. Finance, banking, retail, online business, all of that is not going to sit there and share and try to get better along this journey, along the maturity curve. And so as we get into the sort of next phase of grid modernization that's been going on for more than 20 years, the ability to move to this position where we really are being much more proactive, right? Saves money, makes bills lower, reduces operations and expenses for shareholders, or if you're an IOU, if you're a municipal or a co-op, it's better for your members, lowering bills, and it's great customer service. At the end of this, those are customers that are out there. And we've done a great job in the industry sharing, for the most part, around reduction in frequency, large-scale generation, transmission, substation, and even feeder outages through distribution automation. But outages overall are flat or up in most parts of the country. The actual number of outages, again, 92% of those outages occur between the feeder breaker and the meter. They're all right in the heart in this visibility gap. If we want to really continue to pivot on this journey and make digitization not only a reality, but a benefit for customers, where they can see more reliable and more resilient grid, right, for our businesses, for our communities, we need to get into this area and deploy sensors and analytics, communications that are safe, affordable, speedy, and resilient, so we can come together as an industry and change the operations, climb that maturity curve to where, again, what I was saying was the ability for distribution utility crews to go out and knock on doors and say, I'm here to replace equipment. I'm here to trim the trees. I'm here to upgrade your transformer. I'm here to do these things that we can foresee into the future. It's literally moving from emergency room style treating of the grid to being proactive, preventive medicine, where you can sit there and say the savings in labor, time that folks are going to spend out of power will all pay for itself in a virtuous cycle of feeding back in the ability for the utility operators to take software, to take analytics, to take the talent that's in their own companies, to mesh it with their industrial knowledge and analytics to really deliver the value that you're talking about in this visibility gap. And if we don't do that quickly, you're going to continue to see bills rise, reliability get worse, and we'll look back on this in 5 or 10 years and say, what were we doing? Right. Why didn't we take full advantage of all of these new technologies? Why didn't we operationalize it? What are the benefits that we can pivot to customers, where customers look at their bills, they look at their reliability, and they feel good about these energy providers, whether they're cooperatives, municipals, or larger IOUs across this entire system, which is the world's largest interconnected machine. And it's very complex, as you described.
And I think, I have to, you said analytics a few times, so I'm going to let you dive down that area. Yeah, I think we do not put the words around what actually needs to occur for the cultural shift, cultural change of utilities internally. So there's a significant amount of external stakeholders, and I kind of said this earlier, with this expectation that internally the utilities can deliver on these demands and needs. And so, we said affordability quite a bit, right? It's the kicker, is like to be able to unlock this digital transformation, some fundamental systems and actual piece of hardware as well as some software need to be deployed, which actually costs money. And so we've created a world where, the customer is the customer. So, we have to be cautious of the rates and therefore how much our service or commodity costs. But in between that, you have your advocacy groups, you have your regulation, you have your regulatories, you have your mandates, you have your investors, you have, all of these other players that want to know, well, if you spend $100 million, how many dollars am I going to gain or how many dollars am I going to save? And that is quite complex in itself. So I feel like as we're traversing on trying to understand those fundamentals of like how much this will cost, because there's going to be a cost before it levels off, that conversation is really challenging to have, especially if you don't have data. So it's almost like a catch-22, like to have the data, to understand the cost, to understand the value, to understand the benefit, you got to deploy all of these systems. And so then you're kind of like chasing it. And so like Florida Power and Light, you mentioned you worked for 30 years, like there is an exponential change happening with storms, right? Like there's a big response to how you all execute after a storm comes through, which is fascinating and an engineering marvel in itself, right? So there was that an external driver that really allowed you guys to, push forward, I think, in advance. But like when you think about all of the other utilities that are in the various scales, that conversation becomes very different. But with AI, I'm going to say it, buzzword, artificial intelligence, but really advanced data analytics that can do really powerful things for base fundamentals creates that, I guess I don't want to say business case, use case to drive, this more resilient and secure grid. I guess I just, for our listeners, there's a lot of the, engineering students, early utility career professionals that are really eager to contribute to this energy transition. And so like, teams like yourself are effectively here to provide that influence, that mentoring, that coaching, that, hey, this is feasible, right? So let's get that out of the way. So like now let's execute. And executing is very different than just putting those sensors on, right? There's so much more behind that.
Right.
So for your perspective, like what is your approach, or right, that very dynamic world that you probably well lived in of, educating and communicating that to the next set of leaders?
I see it as two things, but with a focus on one. Two things, financial and regulatory. So here's what you were just saying. The costs are already being embedded in distribution operations and utilities, cooperatives, and municipals today because we're using people as sensors. We're driving to the field when we don't need to. We're doing physical inspections instead of doing digital inspections. We're waiting for things to happen to us at a high price versus being proactive, right? The ability to go out and predict and then prevent these outages, prevent equipment failure, prevent the outage time for businesses, for emergency services, for telecom. Those costs are already embedded in the business, and they are right to be driven out of the business by good investment. Good capital investment for IOUs, good investment for members and citizens of cities, and they're already there. The plant modernization journey, they sold that on reducing fuel costs, the ability to move from coal and oil to natural gas and to renewables. And the fuel savings was the trigger. That was the financial trigger. And those costs are sitting there today in truck rolls, in field visits, in engineers having to go to the field.
They're real.
Number one, they are really there. They're embedded today in your bills. So that the use case in the program pivot, and I don't see it as one use case. I see it as a fundamental shift in how utilities, whether it's IOUs, municipals, or cooperatives, treat their customers. And regulators, whether it's the local city council, the cooperative board, or regulators at the state level, the focus on the customer. And this is the one that I was mentioning before, is that focus on the customer is going to drive all of that. But if you can pivot, continue to make things affordable, power delivery and distribution affordable for citizens, cooperative members, and IOU customers, and drive that down. That's the fundamental piece of it. Focus on the customers and lowering bills and improving reliability. And it's a home run across the board with the ability to do that. And when I say to new talent coming on board, new employees, a lot of the mentees over the years that I've talked to, I said two key things. One, from a leadership perspective, it's not what you're doing, it's who you're working for and with. The ability to have great leadership and learn from somebody, no matter what you're doing in this industry, is number one. And number two, to your point, which I think is really a neat mix, is learn your industrial trade. Civil engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, whatever your trade is going to be in this business. If it's construction work, project management, learn that trade. And we all have to dive right into AI. Buzzword or no buzzword, learning how to apply analytics to drive value in your business. And I believe the young talent coming up through the utilities, through this entire industry, if they could bring those two together and then say, this is how we drive value for customers, right? It is not just electric load that you lose in an outage. Customers are out of power. Families are not able to do the things they need to do. Schools are not open. Emergency services are not available. So focusing on the customer and focusing on your skills, the ability to bring analytics, whether they exist today on your grid or not, the ability to push those programs, we're going to look back in a decade, and we have this pivotal time right now as grid modernization sort of 1.0 is sort of waning, and what do we do next? This next modernization phase, right? One of the things I like to say, Elizabeth, is I like to be a time traveler from a leadership perspective. Jump to the future and envision the future, and then give your future self some gifts. And today we have a chance in the industry to look forward 5 years and 10 years and say, what are the things we should be doing today to make it where customers feel that same thing that over 100 years ago, safe, affordable, reliable, and now sustainable, and resiliency around the power grid. For us to have electrons that cost 3-4 times that across our own country, when it's the same electron being consumed, when our delivery and our efficiency around our companies and co-ops and municipals, we can get better. And by the way, all of this stuff is coming together. The analytics, the technology, and the communications are available to everyone. The ability to then apply that into what you were describing, which was our work order systems, our control systems, and our customer systems. They're no different than they were 25 or 30 years ago. But now we're taking real things, and it is a tough leap of faith to be able to say, I'm now going to predict these things are going to fail. I'm going to predict that this fused lateral, this line segment, this feeder, this piece of equipment is having issues, and I can tell real time, not probably, I'm not guessing, but real time I know I've got ice on the lines, vegetation encroachment on the lines. I've got an area that's really prone to wildfires, as an example. I've got a set of poles that are leaning and tilted. I've got street lights that are having issues. I've got transformers and conductor that are having issues along this visibility gap. And pivoting, I think it's got to start with a customer. And I think it's a financial program that we pivot on, as well as getting regulators involved to drive that forward.
So much there. I have to peel back. But well, one story, but I remember, transmission was my first love. And where I worked, the transmission and distribution operations center was in the same room. And that was the first thing I realized is like blindly I would do studies for 12 years where, to ensure system stability, you drop the load, right? And load was just like a little arrow at a bus in a model. And, if you did not drop the load, you would have a cascading blackout like 2003 Northeast, right? Or the blackout in San Diego in 2009, right? Like, go read about it. It's really interesting how they occur. It's many events that ultimately happen. But like in the end, if you don't have that visibility in the transmission world, you could roll out, all of your customers connected a very large grid. But in the same room was your distribution operators, and every breaker, every switch had a chunk of customers. And then you had your critical customers, your hospitals or schools, right? Like that you just mentioned. And you have your individuals. And then you get into this whole philosophical space of like, what is a critical customer, right? And so you're designing your grid in a very different formula. And the last thing you do is drop the customer. I mean, that is so dynamically different. So just, for our listeners and just to kind of be with you on that. And you don't know what you don't know. So like you're in an industry and you believe that you understand the power grid, but you're only in the transmission space. And I remember like there was never a distribution folk in all of my rooms. And then just in 2015, 16, I started seeing some of these distribution folk. It's a whole other world, but you need both, right? And then the other thought was like the whole data analytics and for our future thinkers and leaders out there. Like, and this is just my personal story. I was working on my doctorate as a full-time employee, and I was actually, pregnant with my sixth. And I came into the world of teaching myself Python. I mean, I kind of knew it from my previous days, but then it was like teaching what is machine learning? What is data analytics? What is artificial intelligence? It's not that. I mean, it's challenging, but if you really sit with it, you can teach yourselves. And I think there's so many of those bright minds sitting in a lot of chairs right now that just don't understand that, like, it's just your own leap of faith. And so, like, for leaders of utilities and all of these other organizations, it's like, how do we open that book to others and realize, like, no matter where you are in your world or your career or your space, like, you can dip in and, like, explore it in your mind be book.
It's not mysterious. It doesn't have to be mysterious.
Right. It seems like it is because we talk about it like it is, but it's really very mathematical, pragmatic. There's a space to be taught. So
what I love about what you said and what really is in our industry is physics don't change.
Right.
And so when we're doing machine learning, we're doing AI, we're learning about behavior patterns of electricity and physics. That doesn't change. So if I solve a problem at my utility, my municipality, my cooperative, that can be shared amongst many, many other folks. And as you've noted, this interconnected, massive machine, the largest on the planet, it's a noisy grid these days. There's two-way exchange of electrons and power flow. There's lots of protection schemes that are going on. So the digital grid of the last 15 years is just showing the noise that was going on. But this mystery around AI and machine learning, it doesn't change. We're not looking at buying patterns from customers, the things that change, or weather patterns, something more complex. Is that we are looking at fault prediction. We're looking at how customer load, critical load in particular, are reacting to power quality problems. All those things along the way. Once we solve that problem on my system, right, my 35,000 kV system or my 23,000 kV system, my sub-transmission system, once I solve that problem, I can continue to build on that over time, and it's not going to change. I've solved the problem one time, and it's got lots of legs on that. I can continue.
Another learning. Yeah, the legs. Like you go to solve problem A, and in all of the methodical work and due diligence and thought process that occurs to get to A, you actually solve B, C, and D. And you can't predict technically that happening until you do it. So it's really hard to put that in your business case and your use cases. You have to we have to have a mindset shift of trusting that this reality is here. And I guess I'm going to go a little philosophical with us because I'm getting excited. But technology is only as good as the people who use it. And so we can have the most advanced AI. And I think what we're talking about here is like base fundamentals of like system performance of the existing grid on how it acts. Like we're not even, and I think that we get tripped up with all this massive information being shared, like going straight to nirvana, right? Like we're like talking about base. But so if your teams that are being asked to invest in it or take the risk in it, or even, hire a new way of thinker, I don't know, right? A new talent. If your team doesn't trust that output, right? And then becomes this, and I think this kind of has happened over, and you probably saw it in your experience, the disconnect between like the leadership that's like putting the investment in and trying to change the way we do things with the actual field operators or the system operators that are living it and breathing it and keeping the lights on. Like that's their focus, So I was just like, from your experience, like that human intuition of like changing how those that like intuitively operate the grid, right? That's a dynamic shift. So like, in your journey, can you explore that a bit? Or like how you embrace
So let me give you a couple examples. Let me react to that and give you a couple examples. So the electric grid is very much like the human body in the sense of, when the immune system is beat up, right, you're more likely to get sick. Right. So in an ice storm, in a lightning storm, in a thunderstorm, a tropical event, a windstorm, whatever it may be, your weakest pieces of the grid are going to fail. And today in this visibility gap with the right technology and innovation, you can start to see those pieces of the grid that are weakened. you can see a high voltage distribution transformer. And my experience is that the field employees are more focused on the customers than as you get further away from the field. And I think those field crews and engineers and supervisors would much rather change out a high voltage transformer due to a primary winding coil short in the daytime, right, at 3x the reliability improvement and half the cost than in the middle of that lightning storm, the middle of that afternoon thunderstorm, or in the middle of an ice storm. Those kinds of things, changing out conductor that's pitted, insulators that are cracked, right, poles that are leaning and their structure is poor. You could see the poles moving, digitally understanding that. Street lights, all of those things on this grid.
What David's is all of these use cases.
All these use cases, right? Yeah. But if you think about it, I think the folks in the industry that are closest to customers would relish in the chance to be able to say, I want to move from being a first responder mentality in the middle of the night when things are the worst, and these pieces of equipment and conditions on the grid, that we can move from middle of the night emergencies to more efficiently in the daytime. It's better for customers. We're doing the same repair work.
And the workers.
And they love it. They will, if we can get behind it financially with the regulators with a focus on customers, the field crews, engineers, and the folks running these teams are customer focused. And they want to see us making sure.
Customers too, right, Dave? That's like another thing that we should, yeah.
All right, they are customers. They're, by the way, in hurricanes and tornadoes and flood events, those same employees are out of power as well. They're the ones that want to see the grid operate as reliability as possible.
And so I think what we're talking about is, this idea of trust. I've been drafting this op-ed for a couple of months right now. I mean, ideally, when you think about what's occurring, it's between leadership, the data teams, right? So data teams are like this new set of thinkers. I think I said this, I need a better word for it, but it's like a new phenomenon. Like here comes 2 or 3 guys that understand all the data sets and how they all interconnect to deliver to the operators and the field employees. And so that there's a whole space there. And then externally, the utilities themselves are rebuilding this trust with the communities they serve, especially when it comes to new technology rollouts, because it costs money. So, trust isn't built overnight. And, I think I'm going to, just because you've been through it, so that's where I'm going to pick your brain. You've probably had to explore all of those various trust building exercises, and you kind of leaned in on a bit, but that's like a whole area of study, right? Like this whole transparency, consistency, willingness to admit something's wrong, like the culture of continuous improvement. That's all necessary language that I think is missing in a lot of the boardrooms and the workrooms before they go out and dispatch the crews, right? So, and maybe it's not missing. So what's your experience?
No, I think you're right. I think my reaction is you're completely right. And it varies on that same maturity curve you're talking about. Some leadership are very customer focused with the idea that lower bills, high reliability, happy customers, happy regulators in the situation with IOUs, for example, happy city council members, happy cooperative boards, right? When all that comes together. What you described before is this leap of faith. If you go back 15 years, as we deployed sort of smart meter or smart grid 1.0, a lot of those business cases individually never got to the point where you had a good return on investment. They didn't. And so a lot of folks took a leap of faith. Companies, cooperatives, and cities took that leap of faith, and it paid off in spades. It paid off tenfold what they were assuming would happen. What you described is exactly what happened. We learned things from those early analytics days, that early smart meter information, and built upon it in ways we could have never thought about at the time, right? If we time traveled a bit and thought forward and looked back on the possibilities, I think we're in the second revolution or second evolution of this. But it's got to come down to using the analytics to operationalize that to get the best value from the field. And here's the thing, it doesn't have to be perfect. The business case is so good. 3x the reliability improvement and half the cost of being proactive in preventive medicine on the grid for trimming trees, replacing transformers, taking care of conductor, replacing poles. All of that, you don't have to be perfect. You can actually miss some. So if you only had 80% of the time you were right of going to the field and finding a problem, you more than paid for the investment in the analytics, and you're building an incredible amount of trust. That is my point there, that we always want to go for perfection. We want to boil the ocean. You described it, right, as trying to do too much of everything. We don't have to do that. You can start small with delivering on the areas for your company, your community, where the biggest problems are. If it's vegetation encroachment, vegetation-related outages, attack those. What are your most costly pieces of equipment? Are they transformers? Are they pole failures? Are they secondary failures? What are those issues? And that is not advanced analytics. That is block and tackling right there in the companies to turn around and say, these are the problems I want to solve. I don't have to solve all of it. I can solve 80% of it. I'm not going to catch all of these because there is a latency and geography to distribution that's very different than in the power plants or in manufacturing. So the ability to predict, but give yourself the time to predict and then react to those. Don't give me minutes and hours. Give me days and weeks. And that's going to be a subset of all of these things you're going to do. And more like a logistics company, distribution, you need to go drive somewhere, right? An hour, 2 hours, 3 hours or more drive time to get to places on the grid where your field crews can do this preventive medicine on the grid. And so all of that together, I encourage people to think about that you don't have to be perfect and you just need to get started and you need to go after the areas that cost you and your customers the most. And it's not just about frequency because we've done a really good job in the industry focusing on these larger outages, right? It is the high volume of outages in this visibility gap of the grid where if we focused, if we simply put our eye and focus on it, you could both have the frequency part of the equation, you could reduce duration in your most expensive and most customer impactful outages on the grid.
I don't know if you know, but like everything we talked about is really kind of what lights my fire because it's all tangible, it's all existent, and there's warriors like you, champions like you that have seen it come through, the end. And, what we can't forget about is that the technology is there and now focusing on the people and the processes that need to be enhanced or the trust needs to be built. And what we're talking about is like data sets that exist, but very siloed within the utility. And then also the data sets are dirty but not bad, but they need cleansed. And they also have the availability because of the technology to unlock an enormous amount of additional visibility that's not there. So with the data sets that exist, such as your asset management data, your planning data, your reliability data, your storm response data, all of your cost data, your weather data, right? It all kind of funnels in, creating that connected fiber so that all of those data sets can now talk to each other is where we're getting into like AI and advanced technology. And so you're unlocking predictive maintenance, you're optimizing your assets, you're able to forecast your load more intelligently. You can detect that energy theft probably more readily. You can manage your outages, which we talked about a lot, proactively instead of reactively. I mean, the list goes down. You can optimize your workforce, all from really deploying the same set of thought processes and fundamental building blocks. That's what I pretty much heard. And you've seen that kind of work through. At the end game is your system operators are the customers for the internal folk who are ultimately serving that larger customer, us as individuals. And like, we can't forget about that, right?
But we can't forget about it. And so my reaction to that is to help people and the listeners here, just take a little bit of my experience away. This is a business of outliers. So we typically look about, industrial engineering and Six Sigma. We think about moving the mean. We think about moving the mean for frequency of outages, duration of outages, count of outages, or customer impact. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. But this industry in particular, when it comes to reliability, is a business of outliers. Go to the far right on your Pareto chart and see the customers that are having the worst experience, the most transient power quality problems, the most momentaries, the most outages. Go to them. Whereas you as an industry at a distribution company, where are you spending the most money responding to customer complaints, responding to problems, driving trucks into the field, driving engineers to do surveys? If you look at that, that will move your mean on a very small, vital group of customers and parts of your grid than trying to move the middle of the mean and trying to shift big parts of the grid. So I encourage everybody, data analytics is not a mystery. AI and machine learning are not mysterious. And number two, the grid physics don't change. Once you solve one problem, like you said, you can build on it. And number three, focus on the outliers. Take those worst of the worst customers, those most expensive, worst relationships with the industry, with relationships with the companies, and move them to the left, move them to improve it. And you will see your mean move. And you can tell customers we're doing exactly what we talked about, driving bills down, driving efficiencies, improving reliability all at the same time with not an incredible amount of additional investment.
Love it. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing your experience and your wisdom in the industry. I look forward to being on this journey with you as we continue to educate and mentor and coach those utilities to kind of take it and run with it. So
thank you so very much. And thank you for what you're doing for the industry.
Bye.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode next week. Until then, keep powering on.